Dr. Borno, that little notes in the middle says we are live, so I guess we are live. Thank you for coming on to our show. I know you have a very tight schedule today, so I really appreciate you eking out this time to come and speak with us. So we're going to get right into it. Uh, before we go into it, can you tell our audience just who you are, and then we'll ask you some questions.
Yeah, delighted to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation, and excited to talk more about health equity. My background is I'm a physician, I'm a physician scientist. I had a research program really focused on equity, primarily in equity and access to clinical trials. I'm a practicing medical oncologist. I continue to see patients at the University of California, San Francisco, where I primarily treat advanced genitourinary malignancies. Most of my patients have advanced prostate cancer. I'm an associate professor of medicine there. And I spun out a company, a public benefit company called TriLibrary, where I serve as a co-founder and CEO. And TriLibrary has a mission to advance access to cancer precision medicine. And what we do is we take the foundational learnings and the evidence that I generated in my research program at UCSF and develop technology tools integrated with high-touch patient-centered services to improve access to trials and to make trial opportunities more equitable for patients living in the United States.
So wonderful. Thank you for that. When I was reading your bio, right, and I was reading your LinkedIn stuff, I said, my question for you was, why? Why did you spin out this? Why was it important to you? I'm really curious to know.
Well, certainly entering a career in medicine, I was motivated by achieving social justice. How can I use medicine as a vehicle to improve justice? And as an oncologist, I realized that clinical trials had therapeutic implications that were vast, immense. But there were haves and there were have-nots. And we've known for decades, we've really just simply failed to sufficiently recruit populations that could benefit from trials. The vast majority of participants for trials have been non-Hispanic white patients. And we know now more than ever that there needs to be accountability around this. There needs to be diversity to make sure that we're making valid conclusions about safety and efficacy for the treatments that we're developing. And when I recognized this intersection between health equity, social justice, and clinical trial access in oncology, I realized this was an area that I was extremely passionate about and dedicated my research efforts towards finding evidence-based approaches to improving access to trials.
That's what I call passion, right? Because again, it takes that to do what you're doing. What are some of the key barriers or challenges that currently limit the participation, in oncology clinical trials? What are you seeing, and how can these hurdles be addressed? Because you're out there doing this. What are you coming up against?
Well, there's a variety of factors that are driving these inequities, but I would say one of the biggest predictors of who gets on a clinical trial is myself. It's a treating physician. Providers are gatekeepers. 77% of patients that enroll in an oncology trial do so because of a provider recommendation. And so, how do we help providers who are so busy to figure out what opportunities exist and are relevant to the patient populations they have? And what are the pain points and experiences of providers that can be addressed through technology and services in order to improve their ability to provide those opportunities? So that really is fundamentally what I'm thinking about, what TriLibrary is solving for. We know that in the US, only about 13% of oncologists are participating in research. We also know that 85% of patients with a cancer diagnosis are diagnosed or treated in community-based settings in the United States. So how do we expand clinical research engagement in community-based settings in order to broaden the denominator of patients being considered for clinical trials so that providers, the gatekeepers in our communities, can offer their patients the opportunities they deserve?
That is so true. How exactly does the trial library works? Is it a software? Is it a app? Is it a I know it's a database of some sort. Explain how it works.
Absolutely. So TriLibrary is a provider-facing software integrated with technology-enabled navigation. What it fundamentally means is that providers anywhere in the United States can log on to TriLibrary and review opportunities to engage in clinical research. At a minimum, we ask providers to pre-screen their populations for certain clinical trials. TriLibrary reimburses providers for their effort. We provide effort-based reimbursement to providers because we know it takes resources and time to identify clinical trial candidates for studies. And that seldom is covered in these in the conventional way that research is funded. The other piece is we provide technology-enabled navigation to patients. So we have a team of navigators that engage patients using technology tools. And what they do is they evaluate these patients' social determinants of health. So Sharon, you probably know what social determinants of health are. They're the conditions in which we work, live, grow, play. And we realize that there are barriers, pragmatic barriers to arriving to a trial site. So our navigators evaluate three things: food insecurity, travel, and lodging, and provide individualized counseling and resources to mitigate and address these barriers. And so one thing you know is navigation, this concept of navigation is not necessarily new, but
Right.
what is new and what our navigators are doing is providing the support on a pre-consent level. So a patient can actually arrive at the trial site
Right.
and undergo consent and advance with the study activities. And that really is important to help expand access to trials and to achieve our goals around health equity.
You say it's physician facing. How are you getting the word out to these physicians? I mean, that must be an effort because it's like you said, 85% of patients are with these community doctors, right? So that's a lot of groundwork to cover a lot of ground.
Absolutely, and that's where my focus is right now is to
Mhm.
meet and get to know as many providers in the community all around the United States. And it takes a lot of conversations because this is we're talking about their patients, and they
Yeah.
need to trust us. They need to trust the experience that their patients are going to have to make sure that this is worthwhile. And so I spend a lot of my time having conversations and connecting with providers so that they can be assured that this is the right model for them and for their patients.
Awesome. What role do patient advocacy groups and community outreach play in ensuring that underrepresented populations are aware? Do you work with advocacy at all and have access to oncology clinical trials? So you work with advocacy groups as well, or?
So we provide tools so that patients can ask their providers about trial library. Again, our model is provider first because we believe that providers have been the key gatekeeper in oncology clinical trials. And frankly, in this era of cancer precision medicine, where our trials are increasingly biomarker selected, genomically selected, it's really overwhelming for patients
Mhm.
to sort out. But what we want to do is make sure that if they are interested, their providers can figure things out quickly and have the right model and mechanism to take care of their patients if that patient needs to be seen at another health system or needs to be seen at another clinic within their current health system. And so that's really our core focus is to empower patients and advocacy groups to ask their providers for this level of intervention to support their access to trials.
It's almost like a two-prong approach, when you say that, right? Because you're right. I can see is one outcome that we're looking for, but I hear what you're saying. Almost like the marketing is two different marketing. Getting in front of your stuff is physician facing, so they need to know what is going on. But at the same time, too, newly diagnosed folks, they don't even know about clinical trial because no one's telling them. They don't know how to ask about it. And so, we want the doctors to suggest it, and we also want the patients to ask. So it's very interesting. Um, from your perspective, which is what I think you're doing, how can healthcare providers be better equipped to educate and inform their patients about the potential benefits and risks? Because I know a big part of of the lack of representation is this whole distrust. Because I know you've spoken about that, written on that. Is the distrust. How are you guys overcoming that? How are we educating those physicians to overcome those objections?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there is a national effort around Just Ask, and interesting, it's actually the
Yeah,
provider asking the patient because of implicit bias. When
yeah.
you look at the data of who participates in research after they are asked, racial ethnic minorities participate at high rates if they're given these opportunities. And so I usually, when asked the question around trust, I say the data suggests that there's insufficient opportunity given to the populations that we are concerned may not trust clinical.
Mhm.
Obviously, there have been pretty egregious acts
Yeah.
around medical research in our history that need to be acknowledged. Um, However, we do know that there are safeguards in place today that did not exist before that protect human subjects research. And there's actually a field of inquiry that was born out of the 1993 NIH Revitalization Act, an act that mandated that trials include racial ethnic minorities and women in publicly funded clinical trials. And that mandate spurred a field called recruitment science. And with recruitment science, a lot of investigators have tried to understand the role of mistrust. And what we know, it's not up to the patient to trust the health system or the provider. It is up to the provider and the health system to be trustworthy and to create this infrastructure that allows the patient to have the right opportunities and to make their own decisions about whether or not it's a good fit for their life and their journey.
It's true. I have a couple of questions. Underrepresentation is such an important problem with cancer clinical trials. What resources do you use to get a clinical trial library out to the community?
Absolutely. So we use a variety of different mechanisms. We're primarily focused on engaging the community providers to be aware of the clinical trial opportunities, and then through partnerships with community-based organizations that can, of course, tell the patients about these opportunities in order for them to ask their providers, our main channel. Our navigation team, which are tech-enabled navigation, we do have a diverse team of navigators, multilingual, in order to ensure that we are helping to support patients, regardless of whether or not they have limited English proficiency or full English proficiency, and can provide culturally care with cultural humility.
You know, that is so important, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think sometimes there's good intention, but not enough thinking. You just said your team is diverse, right? So when you're going after a diverse population, you have to also have some diverse people that's going to be on the forefront with the communication, because it's going to help to build trust. When you see someone that looks like you, speak like you, it's just easier to build that trust bridge. So I'm glad you mentioned that as well.
And we actually recently published on this. One of my collaborators, Dr. Stacy Loeb, and I, and a few of other collaborators published a randomized controlled trial where we evaluated the role of representation in influencing attitudes and behaviors towards clinical trials. And in this trial, we had videos of patients and providers who appeared either white or Black and were talking about clinical trials. We then asked patients whether or not the information appeared trustworthy. And what we noticed was a significant finding, that patients that self-identified as Black were significantly more likely to trust clinical trial information if presented by a provider that appeared as a Black provider.
Yeah.
To show that racial ethnic concordance significantly influences attitudes and behaviors towards clinical trials. So this idea that representation and diverse representation matters is absolutely relevant for clinical trials.
I am so glad you're emphasizing this point, because when you said it, I thought, yes, again, I'm a survivor myself, and I never needed a clinical trial, but it would be important that I felt like this was someone that I could trust. And I'm not saying I wouldn't trust another race. Of course I would. All of my healthcare providers were all white people, and I had an amazing time with them. But I can imagine the next step of, like, you feel like an experiment with clinical trial. You'd want to know that someone that looks like you could trust their word is going to get you up across the finish line there with that. What has been your greatest barrier in having underrepresented populations join trials?
So I truly believe the biggest barrier for underrepresented populations joining trials is insufficient opportunity presented to these populations. So how do we expand opportunities? We focus directly on enabling the providers that are treating these diverse populations to have the right support to be able to provide these opportunities to patients. And that's our core model at TriLibrary.
With so many different cancers and clinical trials underway and constantly being updated, how does TriLibrary connect clinicians with trials within their cancer subtype and most relevant for their patients?
This is a great question. And so we present to providers the types of trial opportunities that are relevant to their clinical population. Over time, we become familiar with the clinical population that the providers are treating, if they're enriched for certain tumor types, and can present them those types of opportunities to make sure that they are compelling and relevant to their panel.
So it's almost like it's customized then, right? You know who your audience is, you know, because you said it's position facing. So you know what they're dealing with and what they'd be more likely able to recommend. That makes sense. I think this question we might have answered this already. How do you encourage patients to join clinical trials or maybe hesitant at first? I think what you're saying with your team also being diverse, it helps a little bit. Is there anything else that you would add?
Well, we're provider first, so our navigators aren't encouraging patients to join trials. What they do is evaluate social determinants of health and advocate for patients to have resources if they wish to join the trial. We rely on the trusted relationship between a treating provider and their patient to determine if it's clinically appropriate. And what we know is patients trust their providers.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
cancer after all.
Yeah.
Saying, I think this is really clinically worth evaluating for you. I recommend you consider this. Patients typically are interested in exploring those opportunities, and that is consistently what the data is showing. Because we know in oncology, unlike other disease areas, it's not only about the treatment, but it's about the timing of the treatment. Sequence matters so much. And so patients are on a long journey where they're really asking to be directed along this journey in a manner that they feel can optimize, of course, their clinical outcomes, their quality of life. And what we want to see is that they live longer with better quality of life. And we know it's a journey that requires optimized sequence.
Do you speak at some of these conferences where you're in front of a lot of doctors? Because I think doctor to doctor, right, is a trust there. Like, because I'm listening to you and I'm convinced, if I was if I was a practitioner, I'd be like, okay, all right, tell me more. But do you get the opportunity to actually present, before these doctors in group settings and stuff?
I spend a lot of time talking to doctors. And I usually start the conversation with saying, I know you're not looking for other things to do. You're probably quite busy. So how can we make this viable for you? Because you believe in this. You want to offer these opportunities to your patients, but how can we develop a sustainable model here? And that's really how that relationship starts, where we address a variety of pain points. We know technology has a role, and we use technology to mitigate certain barriers, but we know there needs to be a component of trust as well. Human touch as well. Mm-hmm. And so we do engage with services that are required to really make a difference here.
Are you seeing progress? And the reason why I ask this is that so many times we have these great efforts, right? And just feels like pushing a wheel uphill. And I was talking about the flywheel concept recently. You push, and then you see that progress. Are you seeing progress with your messaging? Are you seeing more receptivity to your message? What are you experiencing? Because you're on the front lines, and when you said social justice, I'm a social justice warrior myself. So I know our work sometimes is like talk, and wait. Are you seeing any indication that yes, you're catching on, and yes, you want to continue to do this? What are you seeing in your gut? Because this is something that you eked out time to do.
I'm fired up because
good.
That providers are excited about this opportunity, that it is different.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily just an alert about a trial, but it's more comprehensive. There's a reimbursement for effort for staff time. There's navigation support. There's curation of the opportunities based on their patient population. All of these things are because I'm a treating provider who understands some of the pain points. Of course, I work in an academic medical center, which has different types of infrastructure and unique challenges and benefits. But we know there are some common themes with clinical care. And we are thinking about how do we make this viable for a very busy clinician. I spoke to a clinician just earlier this morning who sees over 60 patients a day.
Gosh.
Imagine that reality, right? And so those patients, and this clinician wants to offer those patients clinical trials, and those patients are likely eligible for a subset of trials. So how do we actually make a viable model to ensure that those patients can be considered, and that provider can actually get some sleep at the end of the day when they get the volume book? And so absolutely, I'm fired up because I'm seeing that we're meeting a need in a very differentiated way. And certainly from a study sponsor perspective, the trial sponsors, biopharmaceutical companies, et cetera, are highly motivated to get this right. They want patients to be at a minimum representative of the patient populations that have the condition, right?
Yes.
But we know that representation is the bare minimum. That frankly, we need to actually do something called oversampling, where we recruit higher sample sizes of these populations than the representative sample, so we can make valid conclusions regarding safety and efficacy. And so certainly today, the regulatory landscape has added a layer of accountability around achieving at a minimum representation, which is good. And now there's a lot more focus on innovation, a lot more focus on trying new techniques to recruit patients, because we know that we've been doing the same thing for quite a while, and it's time to be creative. It's time to think more comprehensively about where can we adjust, modify the recruitment funnel so we can expand the population of patients that are benefiting from these studies.
I know we have another 8 minutes to go. Now you have to go somewhere. I had a question about that. There was a question I had on on virtual clinical trials. Could you discuss the role of telemedicine and virtual clinical trials in expanding access to oncology research? I was curious about that. Do you think, are you seeing progress? What are you seeing in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a rise in utilization of telemedicine, and there was a lot more decentralized clinical trials. What does that mean? Applying different trial activities across different facilities, that you do not need to arrive to one site to get your blood drawn, to get your treatment, to have your safety monitoring, et cetera. So decentralization, allowing you to do it even from home.
Right.
So that's something that was increasingly adopted, and actually something that one of my colleagues, Dr. Raghavan, and I published a paper in JAMA Oncology where we looked at the documentation and capture of adverse event reporting, significant adverse event reporting, to determine if there was a risk with use of telemedicine in capturing adverse events. Because the last thing you want to do is deploy digital infrastructure to do safety monitoring for populations that aren't usually participating in research and not safely monitor them. Right. That's the last thing you want to do.
Yeah.
Right? Make sure it's not suboptimal, that there's no risk. And what we've shown that there was no significant difference in safety monitoring for patients who are receiving telemedicine versus not. And that's really reassuring that you can do this safely, that you can use technology as a mechanism to get patients on trials, to monitor them safely from where they are. And I think that's a really exciting find that certainly was catalyzed by the pandemic. That certainly forced our hand, but I think it shows us there's such a tremendous opportunity here.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking some of the barriers that people face, right? The transportation, the social determinants. If we can, do more with telemedicine and virtual, I think we'd have even more participation. So I'm glad to know that you guys are looking at that as well, and looking at the COVID model, so to speak, and expanding that currently in how you're doing these clinical trials. We know that institutions like the NIH have been much more demanding about increasing diversity in clinical trials. Is there a certain minimum minority requirement that has been instituted across trials? How do they hold the trials accountable?
So study sponsors are now required to really think about achieving representation. And so what that means is, what is the proportion of patients that have this condition in the real world, right? And if it's, 11% Hispanic Latinx, let's make sure 11% Hispanic Latinx is the demographic, is the subset of patients on our clinical trial, that we have parity there.
Makes
so
sense.
That's really what representation is, and that's usually the target. So looking at population level proportions. And around accountability, accountability really is most experienced in the context of regulatory approval, that if you're not sufficiently recruiting these target populations onto your study, recruiting these populations, then perhaps you will not advance to have regulatory approval for your diagnostic, therapeutic, et cetera, and that may impact the ability to bring it to market, et cetera. And so that certainly influences motivation around improving access to trials, because it's a real lever of accountability.
I like to ask this question when it comes to something like DEI and, disparities, representation. What is the, and this may not be business, but what is the business case for this? Because a lot of people think, why am I being pressured, pushed to do this? Because we know that DEI has taken a bit of a hit, and disparities and representation. These are very triggering words sometimes. But what is the case for it? What is the business case for it? What is the moral case for it? I mean, what you eked out time to do this. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm asking this question. What is the case for it?
So clinical trial participation is a social good. Mm-hmm. It requires maximal inclusion for maximal societal benefit. And the most obvious example of that is the COVID-19 vaccine trials.
Yeah.
Rapid participation across diverse populations, accelerated recruitment led to the ability to read out results rapidly and brought vaccines to market rapidly. We have all benefited from that, right? So that is an obvious example of the way that we all stand to benefit from clinical trial participation. Absolutely. Now, the business case question is that if you are able to accelerate recruitment overall, end your study quickly, well, you reduce R&D cost, because it costs money to keep trials open, and you also bring drugs to market faster, and so you can generate, profits around these assets. And so that really shows that there is an obvious business case for doing this, absolutely, and it is worth the front end investment, absolutely, because of the ability to reduce R&D costs and bringing drugs to market.
I asked that question. I liked how you answered it too, because I think sometimes people they don't want to say, but they want to see the business case. Show me the money. Why should I do this? Why should I invest? And so I just even think, even in some of the messaging, that we can show that there is money to be made. Unfortunately, I hate to say it sounds kind of crude, but there is a moral case, there's a business case. And so I see benefits all throughout. All right, we have one more minute or so. Time for one last question. Are you seeing more real world evidence studies being used for clinical trials to help bridge the gap for diversity?
Absolutely. Real world evidence is an important mechanism for understanding the role of different therapeutics or interventions in general across diverse populations. However, we should be mindful that current data sets are quite biased. And when we're making conclusions among current data sets, we need to understand, are they actually sufficiently powered yet to make these conclusions? And so I say cautiously that this is a mechanism for advancing health equity, but we still have so much work to do to prospectively include diverse populations in clinical research.
I'm going to give it one final word, Doc. We always like to end the show with something uplifting. It's called T Talks, right? It's about our T cells. So what would be your key thing you want to say to that physician, your target audience? What would you like to say as we end our show today?
I'm optimistic that the time to make health equity in clinical trials is now. We have the technology, we have the model, we understand the pain points, and we can make this available for any patient who could benefit. It doesn't need to be hard for the patients. It doesn't need to be hard for the providers. And we can do this today. And this is an exciting moment for our patients.
Well, we're so grateful for you, for your work. And we thank you for coming on our show. And we thank our audience for participating as well. And those of you on the replay, feel free to ask questions in the comments even after we finish airing, because we will answer as best as we can. And I just wanted to remind everyone that, we have a ton of conferences coming up at Total Health. Feel free to go on our website and register. Dr. Borno, thank you so much for your time. And we wish you all the best with Clinical Library and your work that you're doing. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
All right, bye.